How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Eulier Gonzalez here. So in this video, I want to look at this hook called side effect, or known as the use effect, to actually dive deep into this, understand what is the most common use cases, which is the reason why I'm looking here at the Just Comeva course to understand is how do we get here, right? TLDR is that. So just to make a quick recap of how do I get here is by first look at the model one to describe is, well, what is React, where it come from, what is the problem that it tries to solve, which is how you have now a piece of information, all right, and you keep sync across different UIs. Why is this? Because the way how now we build applications in this MVC pattern, when you have now the model, the piece of data, the view, and the controller. So a model, it was a specific model was attached to a specific view. So if your model is in that layer, right, is all of your model and view and controller are now on that specific layer, and if that model, the piece of information now is shared across different view, so you have to synchronize all of that, right? So React say, no, wait, we're gonna have now a one single place to synchronize this, the R&D at Facebook, and now we only care about is writing the specific UI, and when we need it, we're going to now is hook into this React tool and pull that data out of this, right? So, and all of this happening is on JavaScript. So not only that this work for the web, which is using now the React DOM render, but also for any other application or platforms, whether it is the mobile with React Native and the WebLG. So this idea, which is the whole point of React, right? Initially, to have now one single piece of data, and from there you have multiple UIs that use that same data. So when this change, now it will reflect all of these changes across any UI that is using that. Now, to understand now how these things work and what it's doing behind the scenes, then we look at is how you can create a React, how React is, or what React is doing behind the scenes, which is any time that you now call a React function called create elements, where you specify, at least on the web platform, is the specific HTML tag, right? An input, a div, paragraph, headings, articles, you name it. So what it's doing behind the scene is now creating is an object that represents is the current state of that element, and that is, well, the children's. So if this component contains more nested content, the props, if they receive any data from this, the key to uniquely identify these elements across all of these other UI elements, among other properties, right? So, but the point of this is that as we create now our application in this way, which is essentially is JavaScript code, it makes quite tedious to always create or always call a React application anytime that we need to create is a single user interface, right? So that's why the GSX kicks in and say, hey, because most of the time what we do in our code is just write HTML code and then synchronize that with JavaScript, all right? So that's why we have now GSX. So far so good, because this new way of writing components or describing is the UI, it has a couple difference, especially with this GSX syntax. So for example, like forms, and now it is called HTML form. The way you describe the attributes or event is using the camel case. And this, unlike any other templated language like Blade or Liquid for Shopify, from that, they have their own specific set of things to do on the template, the common tasks to do on the template. So for example, is conditionally rendering elements or list a render of elements. So they have now a specific UI, but here in React we don't have that because we are reusing is JavaScript to do so. That's one of the things that when Josh mentioned here, and when I dig in, I find out very, very relevant. Very, very relevant. But in any case, you also have, for example, from PHP is Blade, from Ruby and Rail is Liquid. So when it comes to describe our UI in this component way, when we have is the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS in one single bundle, all right? And as we look at how can we now pass properties and what the children property has, looking at the anatomy of the component, then we ask ourselves how this component fits in the entire web development, right? That's why we look at, well, the common project structure, where you have the index, that is where you put, for example, where you define your CSS styles and anything related to JavaScript, and how the React is going to mount that component into the HTML DOM. And then you also have now the app base, or the powerhouse of React, where this is you define things like your providers, something that we're going to see that later, your context, or any specific data that you want to pass down from the root of your components down the tree, right? Known as the one-way data flow, or props really. So this way of writing applications in this componentization, now we look at the most common things that we do in UI, whether it is to list elements or conditionally rendering elements. So whether it is using now array froms or even a convenient function called range to actually render a collections of elements in React, and conditionally rendering elements on React using if early returns, so if statements, or the ampersand or the expressions statement. The difference between a statement and an expression is that a statement is something that evaluates an action, where an expression is something that returns a value, right? Where evaluate now, it returns a value. It evaluates and then it returns you a value. So statements like the phrase that would you really? Okay. You didn't catch it. Anyway. Yeah, it's a mosquito. Anyway, so yeah, this is the how you can conditionally rendering elements, if statements or expressions, right? So whether it's using and or ternary operator, uh, and also is how you cannot add style to your component, which is thanks to Webpack or any model bundler, that when you are now build your application or in development mode, you can now is select or define a set of CSS elements that you don't care too much about the name. The name can repeat itself across all of your components in your application, because with CSS model is going to wrap that particularly CSS declaration by adding a specific named to, whether it is the component name and a specific hash, and then the name selector. So this is a way of how you can guarantee now a specificity on your CSS rules, right? And how this element is going to look like. So this is the model one. And on the model two, we look more about is the interactions and the events. Particularly is how you do that is without JavaScript, without React, right? Plain JavaScript, whether it's by attaching a function call to an event listener or by explicitly calling a function directly on the HTML elements. But in React way, this doesn't work like that. It's just, hey, I'm going to pass now a function handler, right? That is React that's gonna call for me when the user interact with or when it detect an event. And this is something that it took me quite a bit to understand, because it's React that is handled that for me. Is handled when this function will be called. I'm just going to pass is this function reference. So anytime that you pass a function and somebody else called for you, Martin Fowler, a software engineer that was part of the Agile Manifesto, and he's currently working at ThoughtWorks, an IT Chicago-based multinational company, where offering services to different companies. They host the, how do you call it, technology radar, which is a way to describe is different aspect in development, right, on the software. So the techniques that we're using in the language and framework, as well as the platforms in what was the other one? Jesus. I always remember. I always forgot something. Let me see. Gamma. Technology radar. It's because it's describing is the techniques. It's describing is the tools. The tools and the language, the platform, and the techniques, right? Exactly, the techniques, the tools, the platform, which is this, and language and frameworks. Okay, so this is 4.1, right? Right now we have is PNPN, Nemo guardrails, ClickHouse, Pydantic, pre-commit. So this is now techniques using GenAI to understand legacy code bases, which is what I'm doing here. Curated shared instruction for software team. ARM in the cloud. Fastify, the part of the language and things like that. And this is very, very interesting. So you can take a look at that when you see that fit. But in any case, back to where we are is this. So, since I know how to respond to user events, now React offer is couple functionalities. One of them is the core loop, which is, hey, I do want is to store some piece of information and uh, access for any part of my application and somehow remember that piece of data. So what it's doing behind the scenes with this user state is relying on closures, which is a way of how you can remember is piece of information uh, that live outside of a function scope, even after that function is executed somewhere else in different part of your program. Somehow now that piece of data is being stored or keep track of. So this is what it's doing now. React is offering that in a more systematic way and refined ways to do so. And it comes also with some other techniques like memoization. Again, something we're gonna see that later on in throughout this course. But the whole idea here is that useState, which is a hook provided for us in React, allows us to store this piece of information, right? And any time that we need to access to that, well, React, as long as we now define that in a particular place of an application, right, we can get into that. We can access to it, whether it is by passing that piece of information down the tree via props, known as the props drill, all right, or by now defining this piece of information in a context. You can think like a little box, all right, car box, where any time that you want to have access to this piece of information in any component, you can that using now a specific hook and a specific way to getting into the React internals that is now allow you to retrieve that piece of information and update that without losing consistency, or well, guarantee the consistency. So this is again part of the idea, the deal here of using React. Okay, so when now I look at how this specific hook work, which is a core React loop. So anytime that you now update the state of this piece of information, or via a setter function that React gave us to, now we can update that state, and React pass through a particular mechanism known as the core loop. Okay, this is now going to, it has two scenarios. So whether it is when on the initial load, where the application is going to be called, and then it's going to append all of these different elements that React create when it calls those functions into the DOM, all right? And then once that is done, once the user can see that, right? Now on the second phase, or the second scenario, is when the user responds to a particular event. That is when the application responds, or when the user trigger an event. So the user now somehow it triggers that, right? And it's going to pass. So it's going to pass through these three stages. So first, React is going to detect which component was called that triggered that state update. Is going to call that component, right? And by calling is that it's going to execute that function, which is at the end of the day, our components, our JavaScript functions, which generate now as the UI state as a JSON like object, right? And if that component contains more JavaScript or React functions, it will continue to call that until there is no more components, aka known as the rendering phase. So it creates now all of this, the new state of the UI, and then it's going to spot the difference and apply only the bare minimum necessary DOM updates, all right, known as the commit phase. and then the browser detects those changes and then refresh the UI that match the new state. All of this is part of the uh, core loop. And understand this is crucial as you move on in dealing with more complex applications that have one state here and there and yada 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 yada. Because most of the time, as software engineers, we're going to read code, not write them. It is very uncommon. In other words, we also is going to remove a lot of the code uh, because most of the time we can achieve the same result with less. So more is less. So in any case, besides the marketing stuff that might it sounds, but yeah, this is the thing. So this is part of the core loop. So I also describe what is the difference between rendering and painting, which is spot the difference, right? Well, as rendering is the phase, this is the rendering, and the painting is when now the browser detect those changes and now update the pixels on the screen, right? So why this is important? Well, because as we look at how you can is update your state and what's happening if you update multiple states, well, it turns out that React is batch those states updates, right? So this is a great stuff because if you think about it, it actually speed up things. So React doesn't have to on any state update on that function handler, needs to is rerun that loop over and over and over and over for each one of those state updates. So far so good, because then I look at how can I is enable or use this hook for common stuff. So for example, like form inputs and how you can collect data from it and attach to that. And the TLDR of this is whether it's using is any input type, text, email, or password, or select, or select, or text content area. Both of them, or checkboxes or rate border, the interface are not the same, right? And so React what is saying, hey, let me now simplify this data binding pattern here, all right? By now exposing is or by is defining the value, the way how you're going to set the value of this input, and the unchanged, so you can get that so you can get that value when the user changes that. So this is great because this specific pattern that happens often, what happens a lot in our forms, is something that we're going to also see in today's video with the side effect. Again, just to wrap the form section here, I look at how to do that, how to work with checkboxes and radio boxes and radio buttons. The subtle difference here, because with radio buttons you want to is detect a particular change, and when that happens, you want to now set the value here to check, all right? And then this is on the checkboxes, and then the radio button, you want to kind of do the same, and because both of them actually export or give you is the value. With checkboxes as well as with radio buttons, you can get the value out of that, and on check property, right? So for example, let me go back a little bit. I know I'm going back too much, but that's because that specific stuff is quite important, at least to know, not only for text area but for radio buttons here, right? And in order to select that exactly on the check property is how you actually is make sure that you select that. But again, based on the value that you will keep tracking of. And the same is for these inputs, right? You're gonna check on the option where you're gonna render a collection of radio buttons. And this quite the same is for when you want to open or out in a checkbox, right? But again, the check and the unchanged and value, right, are both part of the equation here. Okay, on the on how you actually get that or this data binding. So then I look at how you can now set state, set complex state, and how it is always important to return is a new state out of this, right? I'm not going to dive deep into those details. And also how you can dynamically generate IDs, especially when you're rendering is a list of elements, whether you're using the math.random or crypto.getRandom UUID. This is a way to notify React, hey, these components now that I'm creating is dynamically, this list of elements, this is the ID. So you can actually now, behind the scenes, identify which one of them and then update that appropriately. So we don't use the ID in our elements. We don't, most of the time we don't use the index on the array as an identifier, because if that changed the array size, well, you might have duplicate elements here. So for example, if you delete an element and then add new elements, so now that you will have is elements duplicated here. And that's definitely not what you want. So that's a gotcha here for dynamic elements here. And then, because at the end of the day, remember this tool that React give us, which is the state, that help us to now define this piece of information that we want to share across different components, right? Well, it is important where you put this in your user or in your tree, right? Because now this is how you can pass down that data, and when you know when this piece of data is available or not, or somehow you need to store some global state applications. So this is when specific tools to React kicks in, like for example Redux. So Redux is now a global state management solution that say, hey, define me here as a Redux, and then somehow by giving me an actions and the reducer, which is the function that I'm going to execute when I detect these actions to update the state. All right, so now that makes a lot of sense, because we'll have is this deterministic way of what and who triggers that state update. This is why functional programming kicks in and yada yada. So things that are specific to this library. Why am I mentioning this? Because as you now starting to create applications, not only on the client side, which is most of the time where this tool is useful, but for heavy client applications like games, all right, when you need a lot of state, this is when Redux actually is a great deal. And when you now have is the state of the application on the server, for example, SaaS application or back office app, so now we have a different set of problem in this scenario, which is, well, how you can get the right data at the right time, how you now update stale data, which is I think that's happening here in specific problem here. Yeah. How do you deal with this stale data and you revalidate that? How you can now catch the response data so you don't have to hammer in the API often. How you now is do some optimistic updates, aka you now is how you will predict when a request will be done, okay, and then how you can now get the data by pages or pagination from the server. So these 5 things here are very specific to the network, and this is why now there are several tools like Redux, RTK, or SWC, stale while revalidate, or GraphQL, or or GraphQL, or how's the other one? React Query. Okay, all of them are trying to solve this specific problem, the network problem. So far so good, because yes, all right. Now that we know that, then when it comes to working with state, particularly when it comes to look at additional tools, I also create now a war game that's actually pretty interesting, so you can familiar with that. So after I look at the other tools in React, the other hooks, right? So for example, why we overuse these components for anything that we have in our application, despite the component is exclusively for showing piece of information, all right? Or for showing is UI elements, and now how we use components is storing some piece of data and to pass down that data, which actually pollute the applications in an unexpected way. You know, so that's why the React team say, okay, so we have this issue, so we need to come up with another tool called hooks. All right, so hooks allow you to now solve the specific problems, all right, and also is extract some piece of information here, so you don't need to define a component for that. So one of the most common, or the most useful, are the use ID. So it allows now to uniquely identify, or React allows to or React have a uniquely global identifiers, which is useful for input forms, so to identify the label and the input, right? And also the use ref, right, or the hooks, or the rules of hooks, in order to get into this, that hey, you should always put your hook at the top, and yeah, put all your hooks on the top. Let me a second. It's okay if I don't remember. Rule of hooks, right? Rule of hooks, right? Is that always put your functions rule of hook, exactly. Only call hooks at the top level, all right, and only call hooks in React component, except for custom hooks, right? Something that we're gonna see that later. But yeah, this is the thing of this. Why is that? Again, it goes beyond the scope of today's video, but what I can say is that it matters the order here. And React somehow right now doesn't have a way to keep track of function function calls or identifiers. variable identifier. So, but in any case, so then I look at the use ref, all right, and part of the immutability. So anytime that you create now a new state of that, a new snapshot of your applications, you are now is recreating your app here. Again, anytime that you create a new state, is like a new space or a new slot in memory, all right? So there is no way for that to access to. And why this is useful? Well, because in terms of memory, we can now is for React simplicity is always generates a new snapshot, a new state of your applications, and we don't need to even compare a JavaScript where this comparison is expensive here. So that's why we always generate is a new state of our application. So another hook is the use ref, and how useful is this to hold some specific data that you want to preserve across rendering. It doesn't trigger any rendering, and this use ref now trigger is after the rendering happened. So this use ref is most of the time used to interact or grab some HTML elements and then do specific things that you need to. So for example, focus this element input, right? Or to now modify is the play rate, or triggering is the auto on an audio tag is the play, the restart, and so on and so forth. So this is just to solve these specific problems that you have now in React by using this, okay? Because otherwise in HTML and CSS, or in JavaScript, you just only grab that element using the document get element by ID or the query selector, and that's it, right? No big deal. So on that, all right, then I look at the side effect. So anytime that now React needs to synchronize with external systems, all right, or when now, and again, the whole point of this is that piece of data, right? So anytime now React needs to synchronize with that piece of data, and that can be lived on the server, which is the source of truth, or it can be on the client side, right? So somehow we need to synchronize with them, right? So for example, is hey, I do want is to store some piece of information in the local store, or I do want is to know if the browser is connected or not, if there is internet, right? Or I need to is fetch some data from the server and then update my UI, right? Or even is to managing times out, all right? That's quite right. Or I do somehow is to listen to global events, right? These four things that I'm looking here is what now the side effects are in our React applications. So and talking about is the best practice. So effects are hard. Effects has convenient ways to use it, and this is exactly where we look at this. So the use effect, right? So anytime that we want to is in the video above, I mentioned that updating the title isn't quite in real time. I realize that you might think that this delay is caused by useEffect, since useEffect fire after the render. In true, useEffect fire near instantaneously. The delay is negligible, typically less than a millisecond. Why is there a delay then? When we update the document.title, the browser doesn't immediately propagate that change to the tab titles. I'm not sure why, but there is always a bit of delay whenever we change the document title. So here we look at that specific case, and that is, hey, how can I now is update the title of my window, okay? And well, it turns out that by using now this useEffect, when you want to is, well, update that and synchronize that with a counter. So on the React application, you have your source of truth using the user state, and then you want to now propagate that change across other different part of your application, right? In our case is the document.title. So that makes quite sense to use now a useEffect, and also understand how now this side effect works. So by just passing is an empty array of dependency, you're saying, hey, I do want to run this function after the render, okay? So far, so good, right? So no big deal. So here you can look at this. So anytime that you update that, it's supposed to update also is the counter. Of course, it won't do that here. You need to run this locally so you can see the effect. But it turns out that this is the initial value here, right? And any time that now, so for example, if we set this to here, so if I don't put anything, right? And of course it's going to complain about that because they say, hey, oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. But what I'm doing here is with this effect, all right, with this side effect, it's like, hey, I do want to synchronize here this count, this new snapshot of the application, that anytime that this piece of data is updated, I do need is to run this function here with this new snapshot. And that makes a lot of sense. And that makes a lot of sense. So this is a very simple example, all right? And sometimes you might have is activated strict mode, which is a specific React 19 feature to kind of highlight any potential issue. So far so good, right? And then we look at the couple exercises here, like, hey, logging a particular value here, whether it is you create now a useEffect on any state change, makes a lot of sense here, okay? Sometimes the React community say, or the React team say, no. Instead of doing that, you just only do that on the event handler level, all right? So depending on your use case, I will go with what the React teams community say. I'm not gonna go against them, right? So for example, here, do that on the event handler. But this is just to illustrate what the useEffect is doing behind the scenes and why do we even care about that. Anytime that I want to keep track a piece of information, and then so anytime that I want to keep track a piece of data and then do something right after the render, or right after when the render happens, then now I have this new snapshot of data, and then I can do whatever I need to do on that, right? So logging a particular value is a way of how you can see this. Again, I do see why Josh, in this case, used this and set this, right? To say, no. This is just for demo purposes. I'm going to stick with the React dev or the React team does. So yeah. And then another exercise, which is locally persistent state. So not only that, now the piece of information is now, or the source of truth is now stored on the client side, which is on the local storage here, when we toggle here on the dark mode, we need somehow is remember that piece of information, right? Right? Like this in this example. We're storing that piece of information. So how you can do that? Well, because React is going to now, with use state, remember that piece of information on our at the application level. So when we refresh, we're gonna have is a new state of that. So here is when we opt out of React, sort of speaking, and then we need to communicate to some system, a local database that allows to store this piece of information and retrieve that. So read and write this piece of data. So in this example, which was very simple, it was to set now the initial state by reading that piece of information locally using is the window local storage, right? And how you need to parse that to a specific value here to a primitive, because anything that you store locally in the local store is now a string, all right? This is on the initial render, and anytime that you detect a state change, right? So for example, in our variable, right? Anytime that you detect a state change, I do want is to now trigger is this function, right? So anytime that you have a new snapshot of this piece of information, this is going to now run this effect, right? So which is setting now is the local state. So this actually makes ton of sense to go with this, right? But after we look at the effect links rules, right? And what the thing is doing behind the scenes, that makes a lot of sense here, right? Which is sometimes you're gonna see these kind of things, like, right? The React hook, React use effect has a missing dependency. So anytime that you define, and it makes a lot of sense. So anytime that you define now some piece of information, let me actually refresh this from scratch. So anytime that you have now some piece of data that you want to use in a schedule right after the render, right after the app renders here, so well, React is going to trigger this function call, but it doesn't know what that identifier is or what variable is. Okay, so what it say is, hey, you know what? It is important for you to pass me is this reference here in the dependency array, right? Because I don't know what count is, and I do need to is run this with that, right? So it is important to know that anytime that you pass now this reactive state like this, all right, whether it's as an state or a reactive value, which is something that you define in this function, and by reactive value is a variable that is going to calculate it over and over and over anytime this component gets called. So for example, let's say, hey, comes here, salute, right? And I say, hola, right? So this, if I put it here and here, right? If I go to the console, now I get hola, right? And anytime now hola change, aka this component's renders, is going to now it doesn't trigger that. Exactly, it shouldn't trigger that. It shouldn't trigger that. It only triggered that this once, all right? Because this is not changing, so it makes a lot of sense. So no matter how many times I increase this, it will only call that once, right? But when we need to keep track piece of information that change, so for example via the count, right? Remember that any time that that you are now scheduling a function using a use effect, um, React will going to is trigger that with this new state of the with the new piece of state, right? And this is why it's going to tell you, hey, uh, well, I do need to pass me here. Hey, and there's some other things that people actually do. For example, it's like, hey, React, avoid dependency arrays to skip this. And before you do that, never do that. It is important to understand why people actually do that, right? So the idea of this, right, is in rare cases, we need to access the freshest version of a state variable inside an effect. But we don't want the effect to rerun whenever the variable change. Okay? But unfortunately, in this case, this is going to change whenever, anytime the state change. But sometimes we want to run this not when the variable change. All right, we don't want the effect to rerun whenever the variable change in some rare cases. So we'll see how to tackle this situation later in this model when we talk about stale values. So, but in any case, this is what the side effects are with the use effect, what it allows us, and anytime that we need to synchronize to any time that we need to synchronize to a source of truth, which is where this piece of information live on the database or on the server by fetching that data, all right, and then show that on the user, or by storing some data locally, all right, the source of data, for example, so changing the theme of our application using local storage, or to store now the season or some analytic information, right? Or anytime that you need to respond to event globally, okay, in our application, that makes a lot of sense. So for example, it's window resize, mouse scroll, or even input focus, right? So for these specific cases, we have now this specific hook, the use effect. So I look at the couple exercise with the use effects. So at the end of the day, the TLDR is that you can now keep track of a particular state, and any time that change state, we run this scheduled task, all right? And how it also allows us to interact is with, for example, setting our local storage with to enable switching is from dark mode to between themes, dark to light mode. Okay. And how now this array of dependency is keep tracking of this new state, so we can have access to this piece of information in that function, which is known as the effect lens rule, and then running on mount, okay, which is the condition of this hook. So what happened here, and not only the condition of this hook running on mount, all right, but what happened when this component or what happened when this tool is mounted, all right, or is used in a component. So whether it is you passing is by default, if you don't pass anything here, it will call that on the first call, as you can see here, or even if you pass now an array of dependency here, I'm using is the array of dependency to be more explicit about this, okay? But this will call now only once. That's interesting. It didn't get called. What? For instance, if I reload this, all right, you got it. So yeah, you get the idea here, and so this is one of the patterns of how you can use is the use effect. All right, when you need to focus the input elements here, or when you need to listen to global events, all right. And in my case is to say, hey, well, I want to listen to global events. So use effect from React, right? And I want to run this only once, okay? And then I do want to synchronize I want to synchronize is to that. And by that I mean is to the window the add event listener here, and say hey, mouse move, mouse scroll, not sure what is the name of that, mouse move, okay? And this is the function that I want you to do, right? So to make it more easy to do this, is like this is the function here to say is handle mouse move, just to be pretty descriptive about it. And here I know I'm going to receive is the event, all right? And well, I just want is to update that, right? So set mouse position here. This is now the new state of our application, right? X, what will be is the e dot client x, all right? And G will be now event.client G. You might wonder, where in the French story do you get this? That's a good question. This comes from the event. This comes from the event. Let me see if this comes from the event. And the event has now a hierarchy, all right? So all elements will now implement is this in effect, whether it is the properties, right, that you can get access to, all right? Exactly, to have access to that. So anytime that for any elements, right, any elements implement this event. So again, let me take a look at this events here, introduction to the events, right? No. Bubbling and capturing, is this one? No. UI events. I just want to show is introduction to browser events. What about the document here? The DOM tree is the node property, walking the DOM. There you got it, right? Quite close, but not this one. Searching get element and query selector, no property tag. There you got it, no properties and type tag. Okay, but as you can see here, again, this comes from the living DOM standard, all right? That the root of this hierarchy is the event target, right? Is the event target, right? And from this, it will come now after the node, all right? And then on the node, you have now child classes, which are going to inherit this from the event target And from the node, where you have now the document, the elements, and the character data. Again, this is specific to the DOM here, which is any element, any HTTP element here. So in any case, is this one, right? And then this is the event, the UI events, right? That allow you to now have access to all of these instance methods, inheritance here. And from the UI event, you have now several of this UI events. So whether it's the mouse, the touch, a focus, keyword event, wheel, input event, and composition event. So most of the time we're going to use is the mouse event, focus and keyword events. It's rarely to use or input events, right? For example, input events. Okay. It's quite rare as well. Input event. Interface represent and even notifying the user of editable content change. Editable content change. Again, that goes beyond the scope of today's video because mouse event, touch event, focus event, and keyword event, right? So here, this is why we look at the mouse event, all right? And here, why I actually get this client X and client G. Remember, I'm just mentioning is the most common example when we're writing user interface, and in this case the mouse event. So in any case, back to the code here, that's why we are having here, okay. And then I want to is now pass this handle as it is, handle mouse move, all right. And yep, this is mouse move, exactly, mouse move event, which is a global object, all right. And you're gonna get is the event, which is now a mouse event, and there you go. Cool. So yeah, so this is it, right? Mouse move, and this is it, right? It's say, hey, what do you expect something like this? Window at event listener. You got it. All right. So what happened here is that this function or this registration or this subscription will happen is only once, all right. So for example, like this will happen is only once. So far so good. What happens if I don't describe this, right? For example, in this case,
so if I want to track the user's mouse position no matter where it goes within the viewport, I'm going to have to manage that globally with an event listener on the window object. And to help me with that, I'm going to create a useEffect hook, and this hook is going to manage everything relating to this global mouse position tracking. I'm going to put a function, handle mouse move, which is going to receive an event, and it's going to call set mouse position, creating a new object in the shape of the current one. So I'm going to set x equal to event.client x.
One important thing here is that look at how I didn't even pass any state that we want to keep track, all right? Because here I don't want to keep track of. And the funny thing is that even though now React knows what function needs to call to update that, you know, but when you do need to have access to this new snapshot, that's completely different, right?
And do the same thing for y. To register this event listener, I'm going to call window seem to be working pretty well. Unfortunately, there is actually a pretty big problem with the way that I've written this, and if you'd like, you can pause the video and spend a couple minutes seeing, can you detect the problem?
So the problem here is that if you don't pass this, right? here now, any time that this function is changed, that's interesting. Mm-hmm. And now it's stacking all of this.
With the way that I've set this up. Well, one problem is that I'm adding an event listener, but I'm never removing the event listener, right? I'm not undoing this work at any point. And that is a problem, but it's not the one I'm looking for now. That's something we're going to talk about in the next lesson. The problem I want to talk about right now is the fact that I am adding multiple event listeners. In fact, I'm piling them up rapid fire as I move my mouse. And to explain what I mean by that, I think it'll be helpful if we step through this sort of one step at a time. So when this component first renders, right, I create this mouse position variable. It's this object with x being 0, y being 0. I run this JSX with that value, and then I see it in the UI. After that, I run my effect, which calls window.addEventListener, which registers this function to be called whenever the mouse is moved. And this happens totally outside of React. Like, this is a pure JavaScript thing. The JavaScript engine is the one that will listen for this event and call this function when it happens. Then, let's suppose the user moves their mouse just a little bit. So we call the setMousePosition function. Now we have a new object where x is still equal to 0, but y is equal to 204. So we update the UI with these new values, and then we run the effect again. And this is where the problems start, because I'm not actually running this code again, the code to update the mouse position. I'm running this code again, right? I'm adding another event listener. And so at that moment, I now have two event listeners registered with the JavaScript engine that are both going to call this function when the user's mouse moves. And every single time I see these numbers updating, it means I'm adding another event listener, and they're starting to stack up like hotcakes. This method, the window.addEventListener method, we can think of it like starting a subscription, where by running this code, I'm starting a long-running process. I only want to do this work once, the moment the component mounts, and then this long-running process will handle all of the mouse move events. To fix this, I can add an empty dependency array to my effect, which means that this code only runs the very first time this component renders, and it ignores all subsequent re-renders. This is the way it works with a ton of different subscriptions, whether I'm starting an interval, or opening a WebSocket connection, or using something like resize observer. I want to start the process once, and then the process sort of takes care of itself, updating the state as the events happen. I have a diagram that might help explain this, where I have sort of all of the different renders that are pictured here as these vertical parallelograms. And we see that in the very first render, x is 0, y is 0, and after that render, we run the effect, which starts this long-running process. Within this process, whenever the user moves their mouse, we call setMousePosition with whatever the new value is, which triggers a re-render, and we do this every single time the user moves their mouse, but we only have a single long-running process. Now, if we didn't have that empty dependency array, and if we were running the effect on every render, we'd have a situation like this, where after the first render, we run the effect, which starts this long-running process. When the user moves their mouse, we trigger the re-render, but then another effect runs, and so we start a second long-running process, and then a third long-running process, and they just stack up and up and up, totally out of control. And so this is a pattern that it's worth...
And then stacking up over and over and over, totally out of control.
...becoming familiar with, because it's so common, where we have some sort of subscription or registration that needs to happen immediately after mount, but then we need to make sure that it doesn't happen over and over and over again, because the subscription is long running.
Now this makes a lot of sense. This makes a lot of sense. So, but another question is that, okay, so now that we register this, how can I now deregister this? But before that, let's going to look at a couple exercises here. So for example, is that how you can now is resize the window, which is using now the windows.resize. It's pretty straightforward. Right? In this case, you're going to now pass is the global window object inner width and height. Okay, and I'm just wants to register this event only once in this component, right? That's what it is. So far so good. This is resize window. The other is toasty to actually show something here, right? And the accepting criteria is that's interesting. Accepting criteria. As the user scroll near the bottom of the page, a ghost character should slide in, and this is accomplished by observing is the style wrapper here. And this is the pure JavaScript version. Again, we want is to now register or listen to a global events here, synchronize with this external system. Okay, which is saying, hey, React use effect. Okay, and I want to run these functions right after the renders happens. And this is pretty much what I want to do here. Okay, and exactly, so I'm creating is an instance of the object, and when something shows here, right, I do want is to now update our state. Okay, so what I can do this, so if I say function to call is now the showing or show toasty, all right, by saying, hey, I'm going to now is grab that element. Okay, so somehow I do need is to have access to that element, because that's what I'm gonna pass down to the observer. So in other words, I do need is to get that. Okay. I do need is to get that piece of element here, like this. So one way to do this is by using is the ref react property, and I just only want this function once to get that element, which is calling react.useRef. Okay, and I want to store that element here, call as the ghost element. Goes, so how do I call it here? Is the div ref, right? This div ref, it'll be called here the initial render, so I do have access to that element. And then well, I just want to get that particular element. Indeed, I have this element on the current property. I do have that element, but what's happened here is that yeah, I do have that reference here, and then I want is to now is, well, follow this is creating the intersection observer here with the entries. Okay, and as you read these entries, I want to get is one of this entry. That's interesting. Hey, get me is only one of this element from this entry. All right. And if that entry is intersecting, okay, again, all of this is being handled for us via the interception observer. All right, then I want to do something. So here's where I want to show is the element. So what I can say here is, well, this is where I can set here and say, hey, set is show, right? Is show here. Exactly. So now here is say, hey, I do need to keep track of this state to provide you the new fresh state of data, right? And when this is intersecting, I want to show you is to true, by the way. Exactly. I'm gonna set to true. Exactly. So right now I don't need to do this, and otherwise I want to set this to false, right? And after that I need to hold some reference here, which is the observer, right? That this is what I'm going to use to say, hey, I'm going to attach this behavior to this element, to the observe, to this, right? So I want to attach this behavior, right, to this element here, and this is it, right? And there you got it. So because I just only once run this once, okay, so if I navigate down here, I'm supposed to trigger that, but it isn't. That's quite interesting because I never calling is this function, so I need to call is this function is show toasty as it is, right? So when I call toasty, it actually trigger as expected. When I not, it actually hide that. You see? And then it hide that element, hide it, hide it, hide it, hide it. And now we show this. That's interesting because all of that logic of when to show these elements or not is being handled that for the interception observer, not for myself. That's a very, very interesting thing here. That's a very, very interesting thing here. That's very, very interesting. Okay, this is to show toasty. To show toasty and to detect some window object. Okay, so that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.